bumper graphic.
Okay. Oh, says
yes, we're on.
All right,
excellent.
Let's do it.
Welcome. I'm Bill Higgins. I'll be the moderator for the next hour. But in fact, there's only two of us, so I'm going to be moderating my friend Alec Navala-Lee here. The topic is Isaac Asimov at 100 years, and we're going to discuss favorite Asimov books of ours and perhaps of yours. So we have I have an extremely distinguished co-panelist. Alec is a long-established science fiction writer, and maybe you've read his work in analog, or maybe you've heard it in audiobooks. But he turned his hand to nonfiction a couple of years ago, and was okay. Have you got yours? I've got mine.
I got mine. Yeah, I've got a pile of these. So
he published Astounding. John W. Campbell, Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, L. Ron Hubbard, and the Golden Age of Science Fiction, a sort of a multi-barreled biography revolving around Campbell as the central figure of the writers who were most involved with Campbell and sort of define the Golden Age of science fiction. And this, I should say less about this and perhaps ask you to introduce yourself and say more.
Yeah, I mean, you covered all the major beats. So Astounding came out in 2018. It was a Hugo finalist in best related work. And, obviously Campbell is the focal point of the book. But Asimov, when I pitched the book, originally it was going to be about Campbell alone. And my editor said, well, he's not quite famous enough to attract a mainstream audience. So can you make it a group biography? Can you name some other writers who might be part of that circle? And I said, well, I've got Heinlein, Hubbard, and Asimov. And Asimov obviously was probably the most famous science fiction writer in America during his lifetime. And somebody still is, or at least one of the most recognizable science fiction writers. And, so he's a big part of the book. And he was the one I knew first. He was the one I grew up reading, especially his nonfiction, and probably had the greatest emotional attachment to of all the people in the book when I first started researching it. So I clearly have a lot of feelings and thoughts about Asimov.
And since this is the year of Asimov's, that's the centennial of Asimov's birth, I proposed we should do a panel on it at the NASFiC. But there's one thing that's been known about Asimov for a long time, but that Alec has been significant in bringing more to light and to getting a wider conversation going about it. And that is that Asimov engaged in sexual harassment. There's not any nicer way to say it, with lots of the women that he encountered during his lifetime in fandom, in his circle of friends, in publishing circles, and beyond. And this is like a grim truth about an author who was otherwise a lot of people liked him. A lot of people, he was certainly a popular author, but not only did he do this groping, and perhaps you could describe it, but perhaps you have a standard way of describing his problems, but people around him essentially put up with this for decades.
Yeah, and they encouraged it. They saw it as basically as a big dirty old man act that he was putting on. But in the course of putting on this dirty old man act, he actually was a dirty old man who repeatedly groped, kissed, and indulged in all the other kinds of unwanted touching for decades. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it happened hundreds of times. And, I mean, I'm glad you brought it up because, I think we're going to move on to other subjects soon, but it is central to his legacy. I think it's a big part of his legacy. The analogy that I kind of like to use is to Harvey Weinstein. And I know it's not a perfect parallel, but, if you saw someone who was like, yeah, those Miramax movies from like the mid 90s, like Pulp Fiction and The English Patient, they're great. And if you mentioned, well, what about Weinstein's like, sexual, assaults? They're like, what do you mean? You'd be surprised if they hadn't heard about this and weren't taking that into account in considering his legacy. And I think with Asimov, it has to be something similar. It has to be paired, unfortunately, in some ways with his achievements as a writer. And you can't really talk about one without the other. Before we maybe move on, I do talk about this in the book, and I've written at least one big article about it. And I think, until then, it had been mostly part of the oral tradition of science fiction. I think every time I gave a talk on Asimov and mentioned this, the entire audience would start to nod, and usually an audience of older science fiction fans. So it wasn't really talked about in print until recently. And I really think that the real reckoning is still to come. We have not reached the end of this process yet. And I think it's going to happen soon. I think the scrutiny that surrounds the new Foundation TV series is going to bring a lot of this stuff to light in the mainstream. And, we don't even know the half of it. I think, I published an essay on a website called Public Books earlier this year. And it was like fairly widely shared, but it didn't quite go viral. But in response to that article, I would say at least a dozen women on social media shared their experiences, firsthand experiences of unwanted touching, kissing, groping. And that was just one piece that got shared on Facebook a bit. And I think if it goes big, we're going to see many, many more people coming forward and talking about this.
It's a good essay, and I was just recommending it to somebody the other day. Maybe we could put a link in the chat later on.
Yeah. Well, if you look up Public Books Asimov, it'll pop up. And it was kind of my attempt to do what I did not do in the book as much, which I wish I had done, which is talk a bit about not only Asimov's behavior, but how it was enabled by his friends and other people in the science fiction community, which I think is a big part of that story too.
Yeah, he's still a towering figure. He did a lot of important, significant things, and he did a lot of things that the world is, that made the world a somewhat better place. He even had, his political opinions would agree with feminism in a lot of ways, but he just on a personal level, for some reason, he didn't put respect for women or equality for women or respect for people's individual integrity, into his life and his behavior in a hotel for some reason.
Right. Yeah, no, there's a huge contrast between his professed political beliefs and his behavior. And I think that's something that's worth underlining.
But we're keeping that in mind. It needs to be dealt with. It's going to be, as you say, a part of a larger of a conversation that's going to continue going on. And we've seen changes wrought in publishing and in the world beyond because of these conversations, and that's going to go on. But let's turn to who was Isaac Asimov and what was his literary career in Thumbnail.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big topic, obviously. I mean, what I always try to do when I start with Asimov is remember where he started out. Because the picture we have in our heads of this guy, he's a little older, he's got the big sideburns, the glasses, he kind of grew this face for himself that, is the first thing that we think about. But, I mean, he was a young man. He was very young when he started writing science fiction. I mean, he was one of the, member of that first generation of fans who started clubs in New York. He was one of the first Futurians. And he submitted his first stories to John W. Campbell at Astounding when he was probably 18. And he sold his first story when he was 19. And he said that he was a slow learner because it took 11 submissions or something for him to break through. But, he was a teenager. And, one thing I say about Asimov is that, he got better over time. If you look back at those early stories, they don't really hold up compared to someone like Heinlein, who I think started at a high level and stayed there. Asimov, it takes a while for him to kind of become the writer that he was going to be. And he was lucky in some ways to have a mentor like Campbell who saw his potential. Campbell saw Asimov as an experiment to see if he could turn an enthusiastic fan into a real writer. And it obviously worked.
It's true that his earliest stories got swallowed into book collections and cemented into place as classics of the golden age as he went along. But he really became a journeyman, maybe a leading science fiction writer by sort of 1950, and had a tremendous output in the 50s of short stories and novels. And that's probably where you see more mature work, right? But some of the robot stories in his Three Logs Robotics series are from the late 30s and early 40s. Some of his Foundation stories are from the early 40s. So they are fixed in the books, and people do go back and read them. But his stuff gets better, more skillful, and maybe more interesting as time goes on. And he surfs on the science fiction publishing boom of the 1950s very nicely.
His timing was great, obviously. He sort of wandered into the Astounding office, just the right time for Campbell to grab him. He peaked at just the right time to end up in print books. One thing about him that I want to mention is that he submitted his very first story that he ever wrote to Campbell. So he did not have a big apprenticeship period in public or in private. He typed up a story and sent it out. And it's not surprising that it would take him 10 tries to get something publishable, because that's probably true of most writers. In his case, he just kind of did it with Campbell's knowledge and assistance. And those early stories, the Three Laws of Robotics. So if you think about like his big impact on science fiction prior to like 1945, we're talking about the Three Laws of Robotics, the idea of psychohistory, and probably the story Nightfall, which is the one that kind of made him into what people perceived as like a first-rank science fiction writer. All of those things were basically Campbell channeling ideas through Asimov. Campbell came up with the idea of the Three Laws of Robotics basically in his office one day. He was the one, I believe, who imposed the idea of psychohistory on the Foundation series, which was conceived by Asimov in a somewhat different way. And he gave Asimov the premise for Nightfall. Now, I'm not saying that Asimov didn't have a huge part of or doesn't deserve a big part of the credit in those works. He had to actually write them. But, it's not until the war that he starts to break off. He's not physically present anymore in Campbell's office. And you start seeing him writing stories like The Mule, which I think is one of his first really great stories that, again, Campbell kind of pushed him into writing that story, but the execution is his, the writing and the plotting is on a much higher level than it was before. And it's not until then and after the war that he starts to really become a writer who didn't need Campbell to give him the support that he'd received until that point.
Yeah, in the chat, Juan San Miguel is asking about Asimov in the 40s, because when I emphasized his work in the 50s, I was glossing over this the period you're now talking about.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that after Nightfall, he was seen as like a first-rank writer. The Foundation series was very popular, but I think, even the Robot series, which I think it was deservedly popular, had a big impact, just from a literary level. When you go back and read those stories again, at least in iRobot, they don't really hold up as well as a lot of other stories from that period. The ideas are fun, and each story has like a little twist that is kind of interesting to think about. But as far as like character and just like the style of these stories, they haven't lasted, at least for me, in the same way that let's say Heinlein stories did or Ben Vogt stories did.
So we have an idea. The idea this panel revolves around is tell us a favorite Asimov work and pitch it to us. And I think that you've just named The Mule in the Foundation series.
I would say if I had to pick my favorite
as-
Asimov stories, yes, that would be in the top 3, definitely.
What else would you single out?
In terms of
his
like
fiction?
His fiction,
Or in the period that you're talking about.
Yeah. So prior to 1945, it's interesting. I mean, there aren't that many stories, frankly, I would go back and read from Asimov during that period. Nightfall is fine. I think Nightfall has immense historical interest. It's not a story that I need to go back to and read for my own pleasure. I mean, I'll be honest. Okay, when it comes to books by Asimov that I would read again, you have The Mule and like the late Foundation stories, which come from around the end of the war. Those are really good. We talked earlier about a story called The Red Queen's Race, which did we talk about this, or was it with someone else?
It wasn't you and me.
Okay, yeah, no, actually, I was talking to someone else about this story recently. There's a story called The Red Queen's Race, which I thought it was like surprisingly good for that period. But it's not until like I want to say the mid 50s to me, with some of those novels, like Caves of Steel, Naked Sun, and especially The End of Eternity, that I think he starts to really come into his own as a writer whose stuff holds up. And in particular, The End of Eternity to me is like probably his best novel, which doesn't get as much attention as some of the others, but it's a well-written novel. It's got a great premise, and I think it's a secret critique of the Foundation series. I think Asimov is reacting against Campbell's idea of psychohistory by saying, if there really were this like group of secretive scientists who are trying to change the future, it's kind of creepy. It's kind of a creepy idea. And I think End of Eternity is his attempt to bring out some of the weirdness behind that premise.
Yeah, okay. I would pick End of Eternity as my favorite among his fiction too.
Oh, good.
And Asimov begins to dabble in the 1950s in nonfiction, I think mostly in articles. Mm-hmm. And he also, his first nonfiction book is that he prepares a biochemistry textbook with a co-author. So that's not really part of the pattern of the rest of his life, but he knows he knows a lot of science, not just because he's a professional biochemist or a professor of biochemistry, but he has consumed encyclopedias and he has a voluminous knowledge of sort of a little bit of everything, and he realizes he can start explaining it to magazine readers, and he finds the science fiction reading public, certainly people who have some appetite for nonfiction, and we get him. I'm not sure exactly in what year he begins writing regular essays for the magazine of fantasy and science fiction.
Yeah,
but
I mean, I think you're right.
For decades.
I think you're right. It's the mid to late 50s when this kind of happens, and it's partially because of Sputnik. I think after Sputnik, Asimov essentially says, "I've been wasting my time as a science fiction writer when I could be a really great popular science writer and kind of help America, drive its objectives on the educational front, on the scientific front." And also, there's the fact that he and Campbell have a big falling out over Dynetics, which was, the mental health therapy that Campbell had developed with L. Ron Hubbard. Campbell's like excursions into psionics and like kind of weird pseudoscience made Asimov really uncomfortable. And it was getting harder and harder for him to sell to Campbell on the fiction side. So he actually said, "Why don't I write you some essays instead?" And so he starts writing essays for Astounding, essentially because it's easier on him psychologically than trying to work with Campbell on fiction. And then you're right. Then he starts writing essays for fantasy and science fiction and other publications, and just kind of begins this like decades-long process of churning out these really high-quality popular science books, and then branching out from there into history and literature, and basically anything that he felt like talking about. So it's a really remarkable transformation, and you don't really see it until the mid 50s.
And it also at post Sputnik is accompanied by a sudden drop in his fiction output.
Right.
And he scarcely writes fiction anymore, and he doesn't do any novels between the end of the 1950s and the early 1980s, except for one screenplay adaptation.
Yeah, well, I mean, the gods themselves is like late 70s, right? Mid 70s.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
But that was the exception. That was kind of him wanting to show that he was still at the top of the game in some ways. But yeah, you're right. I mean, he kind of stopped writing fiction. It's one thing that's kind of interesting is that this is kind of a side note, but I often see Asimov listed as like this insanely productive writer on the fiction front. People say, oh, he wrote hundreds of novels, but it's not true. He actually wrote hundreds of books, most of which are nonfiction. And if you look at his fiction output, it's actually, I won't say it's modest, it's certainly substantial, but there are a lot of other pulp writers from that period who probably wrote the same word count when it comes to the fiction side. It was really nonfiction where Asimov said, I'm going to become the most productive writer in American history. And he did.
Did he actually set out to do that? Was that a goal he stated at some point?
I mean, he certainly took his book count very seriously. He told his wife, I want to write 100 books. And he saw that as a personal milestone. And, one little fact about Asimov is that he did kind of pad that book count. He included a lot of anthologies and collections and books where his involvement was kind of minimal, where he wrote the introduction and some introductory material. And he said, okay, well, this is a book. And we could quibble about some inclusions in that category, but I think the point still stands that he was very productive, but he took pride in that number because I think he actually said, that I'm never going to be known as like the greatest writer in the world, so I may as well be known as the most productive.
Well, and when he got to the 100th, a book count of 100, he produced a book called Opus 100, which was kind of like a clip show, a collection of writings from earlier books and some autobiographical material, and a book that's celebrating, hey, I have written 100 books. And I gotta say, Alec, when you have written 60 or 70 books, if you want to pad your book count a bit and claim it's 100, I'm going to indulge you as well.
Right. No, that's fair enough. And he was actually very open about this. He discussed, that his habit of adding those to his total Opus list. And again, he then published Opus 200 and he published Opus 300. So, it clearly meant a lot to him, those milestones.
And it was a little bit fascinating to those of us who are kind of numbers people. So right. I remember going through the list of books in the back of, I don't know, Opus 200 or something, and trying to make my own count. Hey, how many Asimov books have I read? And sometime about 40 years ago, I counted them up, and it was sort of in the neighborhood of 60.
That's pretty good.
So I couldn't keep up with him, and I didn't want to read every book Asimov wrote, and I certainly didn't want to reread the stuff that he was repackaging and different. But I felt myself a pretty good Asimov fan when I had that number.
And I will say, to be fair, that count of books also includes massive books. It includes books like his Guide to Shakespeare, his Guide to the Bible, his memoirs, his Guide to Science. These are hundreds of thousands of words long. And I think when you balance those out, I think he is. I can forgive him including marginal cases, given the fact that he only counts, say, those memoirs once.
Right. There's well, okay. I'm going to go on to some of my favorite nonfiction, because I think, not because nonfiction is more important than fiction in Asimov's case, but because I think a lot of people have looked at and examined and commented and done scholarship on Asimov's fiction, but that his nonfiction hasn't gotten nearly as much attention, even despite the size of the body of work. And Asimov's nonfiction, where people talk about how watching Star Trek inspired some people to become scientists, or inspired somebody to invent a kind of telephone that would flip open like a communicator. What effect has Asimov's nonfiction had on readers all over the English-speaking world, all over the translated world.
Mhm.
If you like Asimov, at least sort of, and you're curious about a subject, he's got a book and you can reach for it. When you get interested in a new subject or a new period of history or something, Asimov is there for you, a familiar name on the shelves of the library. No one has really plumbed the impact that might have had on readers. Once I got to be a professional physicist or interested in professional history, well, Asimov's stuff seems kind of like more simple to me. And I don't, necessarily, his little sketches of the history of atomic physics are not as detailed as what I would reach for in an academic text. But by gosh, when I was 16, that stuff was great introduction to these subjects. And if I only had a kind of casual interest in the subject, Asimov is writing at a perfect level for me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I use him in that way too. I've got a copy of Asimov's Guide to Science on my shelf here. And, whenever I have a question, I'm like, I don't know enough about this, I will often go there first because I know I'm not going to be bored. It's going to be well written. It's going to be clear, and that's a great first step. Asimov said, well, so a lot of these books, not all of them, but a lot of them are just him in his office looking at the encyclopedia. He was really good at taking other reference books and distilling them into popularized versions. So he would do books like Words from Science or Words from the Greeks, and he would just have the dictionary open, and literally be typing while looking over at the dictionary. And, at one point, there's a story that one of his colleagues at the university said, "You're just copying the dictionary." And Asimov said, "Okay, if it's so easy, you do it." Because it actually is very hard to take this information and transform it into a form that most readers will want to experience. And he was great at that. And it was a skill that I will say, I probably like his nonfiction more than his fiction in many respects. And I'm glad we're talking about that now.
I will introduce at this point, let's see, let's do the screen share. And because I have a picture of queued up someplace, this one here. I don't have a copy of my own of this book, but it was a very memorable discovery on the library shelves when I was in high school.
Oh, yeah.
Do you see The Noble Gases?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm in high school. I've read a few Asimov books, and I'm browsing the library shelves, and here's this book called The Noble Gases. And as you can see from this cover, there are 6 elements. And I pick up this book because I want to know, like, how could you possibly write an entire book about only 6 gases?
Mm-hmm.
A couple chapters of this, probably interesting, but at book length, what does he do? Like, how could he possibly sustain it? So that curiosity gets me to open the book and turn the pages. And I read The Noble Gases, and in order to explain why some gases are called noble gases and what makes them different from other elements, Asimov has to, in the early chapters, introduce the ideas of chemistry, and you also get the history of some of the people who developed these ideas. So actually, by the time you reach the end of this book, it's a pretty good education in the world of chemistry. And a little bit about atoms and quantum mechanics and stuff. And the reasons, the behavior of those electrons is the reason that the gases don't like to hook up with any other elements, and they're aloof. They don't touch each other. They don't touch other elements, and that's why they're called noble. And near the end of the book, this probably motivated Asimov to write the book in the first place. He describes recent discoveries in the 1960s where someone has actually been able to make a compound out of xenon. Or by the time he's writing, there's like a couple different compounds. So something which had been considered impossible through the history of the noble gases now seems to be possible, and new stuff is beginning. And so I learned, I got a little education in chemistry from that. And I was probably, I don't know, maybe a sophomore in high school or something, or a freshman. And that gave me a bunch of knowledge that helped a lot when I actually hit a chemistry course. And
Yeah.
many years later, when I got to graduate school, and I met Barry Game, who was another graduate student at Michigan State. And Barry and I had a lot in common. And as we probed and told jokes and tried to one up each other, we were and kind of learned, like new friends do, what is this guy all about. We quickly discovered that he had found a copy of The Noble Gases by Isaac Asimov in his high school library. And he had devoured it and gotten a really good education in chemistry. And that made him very interested in chemistry. And, reading more by Asimov made him want to be a biochemist, just like his hero, Isaac Asimov. So Barry became a biochemist, and he still is one.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's actually a really great subject. I don't know how you'd approach it, but people always talk about how the Heinlein juveniles inspired people to enter the sciences, and I think, as you said, you can make a pretty similar case for Asimov's nonfiction. I mean, I know that he talked about writing a book on quasars, and I think it was quasars. And he said that it was going to be like a very short book, but he realized that to explain what a quasar was, he had to kind of move back and explain a lot of other stuff too, and it ended up being essentially a overview of the universe until he finally got to quasar. Yeah,
it's a great anecdote. His editors wanted a book about quasars, and what he delivered was something that turns out to be, because he needed to explain what a quasar is and why it's interesting and why it's different from other things astronomers had studied. Then he had to explain, like galaxies and modern radio astronomy. And then that kind of means like you have to go back. And the entire history of cosmology is in this book. But, okay, so it fails to be a concise book on quasars, but it's a great introduction to astronomy, and it's particularly cosmology circa 1965 or so. And it begins in 600 BC. The Assyrian Empire had just fallen. So that's what Asimov needed in order to tell you the story.
Right. I love that. Yeah. No, I mean, everything is connected. That's one of the things about him that I love. It's like he was curious about some things, certainly about anything that you could learn through a book. And, he was kind of built to do it. He didn't like going outside. He was, he was kind of an agoraphobe. He liked being in his office. He liked to write. He was a fast typist. And he had this like skill for popular science or for explaining concepts in a way that people could understand. And you kind of put those things together and you get 400 books. It's sort of like axiomatic. That's what you'd expect to come out of that person.
Yeah, it's and like he did a pretty good job on a whole lot of stuff. He did some things that, after you've read a bunch of them, maybe you could see that there's a formula, like the books about words.
Yeah.
But he was quite good at delivering an interesting book about words. So why not? Now, yeah. A big event I see in his career is that is not just, well, he begins to write science essays, as you say, for Astounding. But I think in the late 50s, he begins to write an essay every month of a certain number of words for fantasy and science fiction. And it's mostly a science column, but he sometimes turns to other nonfiction topics. And he realizes that after he's written 17 months worth of these, he's got almost enough to make up a book. So he writes a few thousand words of introduction, and Doubleday chops off the 17 essays and puts it out as a hardcover. And then, 17 months later, it's time to do it again. And there's a whole shelf of these. There must be 10 or a dozen of these kinds of books. And if you're prowling the high school library shelves and you're familiar with the name Asimov and you come across one of these books, you might like them. And you might read another one and another one. And because he's so wide ranging across physics and chemistry and astronomy and whatnot, and maybe another thing we should look at is that Asimov loved a historical approach to anything he was explaining. So you can't read a whole bunch of Asimov stuff about chemistry or physics without learning quite a lot about the history of chemistry and physics.
Yeah,
and
I think history was one of his first loves, and you can see that in the stories he chooses to write. I'll let you finish, but one thing I always thought was kind of funny is that he gets the idea for the Foundation series on the subway, going up to Campbell one day saying, I need to think of an idea to pitch. And he said, it's like the decline and fall of a galactic empire. And he kind of mentions as an aside that he'd already read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire twice. And he was like about 20 years old at this point. And I'm like, I still haven't gotten through that once. I've tried for a long time, but he devoured it. He loved reading history books. And I think he was actually really delighted when he realized at some point that he had established enough of a brand name so that he wasn't just writing about science anymore. He could legitimately make a case for himself as someone who could write books on history and literature and just kind of whatever subject he wanted, because his name carried that much weight. You could slap, Asimov's name on the title of a book, and the best title for his Guide to Shakespeare would just be Asimov's Guide to Shakespeare, and that would attract readers who knew that they were going to get a good product.
Yeah. So by the late 60s, this rolls into another subject I find kind of interesting. By maybe the late 60s, certainly the early 70s, he has become kind of a high-profile literary figure, not in the top people of American letters, but he's noticed, and he's, he gets reviewed now and then, and it helps, I think, that he's probably socially connected to a whole lot of writers and editors around New York. But he there's a rise of him as a public figure, and he with television interviews and lecturing, and people coming to him for an article for this magazine or that magazine instead of him having to go pitch people. Can you say something about that part of his career?
Yeah, no, he was a great interview. He did really well on talk shows, and he was a great speech maker. A great public speaker. I think, like around the time you're talking about, he actually earns a lot of his income from giving talks, and he will just drive around any place that he can drive to. He doesn't like traveling in any other way. He doesn't fly, but if he can drive there, he will give your Rotary Club group or whatever it is, like a good hour talk, and it's all extemporized. He doesn't need notes, and it ended up being like a big deal for him, financially, and he became really wealthy. It's one thing I want to talk about his memoirs at some point, but one thing in his memoirs that I find really amusing is that he's very detailed about how much he got paid for everything he did. He said, it's a big part of my life, and my income kept rising, and to him this was a sign of it was a kind of validation or vindication of the choices that he had made, because he walked away from a career in academia. He made that choice to become a full-time writer, and his fame and his financial the financial rewards to him, it said I was right. This was by far the best choice for me.
It also, starting out in fandom and as a science fiction reader, so somebody who is reading, who liked to read a narrow wedge of the available fiction, and science fiction people felt themselves an embattled community of really smart people in the 1930s, right? That maybe that mindset had something to do with growing into, with the satisfaction of growing into a widely accepted public figure in the 50s and 60s.
This is a good transition to bring up one of the books I wanted to bring up. So, so this is the Hugo winners, and you know, again, this is an anthology of other people's stories that Asimov wrote introductions to and counted as one of his own books. But you know, honestly, he earned it because these introductions are wonderful, and he kind of became the ambassador of science fiction to the mainstream. And you know, this is a time when science fiction is expanding. It's you know, growing beyond the initial circle of fans that it once had. And Asimov, you know, you read these stories and you know, there are some attitudes in them that are a little bit difficult to stomach these days, or in the introductions. But he makes science fiction seem as intimate and as, you know, closed a community as it had been in the 30s, and it's full of inside jokes and these like little anecdotes about writers. And you read these stories, and you read his introductions, and you feel as though you know these people. And I think his personality and his ability to kind of make people feel like they were part of that community, you know, was actually a huge part of kind of maintaining the culture of science fiction, for better or for worse, you know, during that period.
Yeah, indeed. The introductions that he writes to the Hugo winning stories in there, and the stories that he tells about his fellow writers are the first glimpse a lot of us had into the world of fandom. The world of science fiction enthusiasts. Hey, they're out there. They have conventions. Sometimes they become professional writers. That sounds interesting. And, you know, it instills in the reader a desire to, you know, find out what a convention is all about, or attend a Worldcon, or maybe even a Hugo ceremony sometime.
Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of the information we have about science fiction culture during that period comes from Asimov. One thing I wanted to mention while we still have time is, so if I had to just have one book of his to take with me, you know, to my desert island, it would be his memoirs. So these first two volumes, I mean, you can tell these are like massive books, right? There's like phone book size memoirs, and they are so detailed. It's like every day of his life, especially from like the mid 50s on, is like chronicled here, and they are wonderful. I mean, I know some people can't get through them, but long before I thought about writing about the history of science fiction, I loved reading these books because they were a picture of this ideal writer. At least that's how I felt when I first discovered them, because they're like, this guy, he was a machine. He loved his work. He just produced on a regular basis for decades. And you know, if that's the kind of career that you want, I've never read a book by a writer that kind of gave you a better sense of what it felt like to actually be that person and kind of be someone who could do that for a living.
Yeah, and there's a feeling of intimacy that you get from you know him after you've read that many hundred pages. He keeps it interesting. And the first volume had come out in 1979 or so, at a time when I'd been to a couple of Worldcons, and I realized that I was going to be in Boston for the 1980 Worldcon, and probably Asimov would be in Boston for the Worldcon. Mm-hmm. So I got together with some of my friends, and we wrote him a letter offering to take him to lunch. Okay, and when we all got to Boston, we indeed had there were about 8 of us, I guess, that met with Dr. Asimov and his wife, Dr. Janet Jepson, and we had a brunch in the hotel restaurant, and you know, ate pancakes together and asked Asimov the questions that we all wanted to ask him, and you know, told him the jokes we'd been saving up and whatnot. And you know, that was my one more. I didn't really have any other encounters with him after that, but I was the envy of everybody back in East Lansing. Certainly once it was done.
That's awesome. Yeah. No, I mean, everyone has some people have like better Asimov stories than others, but you know, he was such a presence.
People have better ones than that, but
yeah. I mean, I'm also thinking about people who got groped by Asimov, you know, which is not a great story. But you know, he was a presence, right? I mean, it kind of circles back to what I was saying before about how, you know, you have to kind of talk about both sides of his personality. He was such a huge figure, not just in written form, but personally at conventions as probably the most famous person in the room. You know, anytime he was at a convention, you know, his people looked to him, you know, and in some ways it was a positive thing, and in other ways it was not. And I think that's something that we have to talk about.
Well, he was a raconteur and a jokester and a guy who I think all his life thought humor was really, really important to try to get people's attention or to try to be a significant person in the circle. Even before he was famous, that's how that's how he was socially
Right.
put together.
Right.
I am the same way to a great extent, and so I kind of feel his efforts to be to try to be funny in every situation. You mentioned that that Asimov's Treasury of Humor was a book that you were that you had enjoyed. At some point, okay, the Bible, the dictionary, some history, whatever, Asimov eventually wound up compiling books full of jokes because it turns out Asimov knew a lot of jokes.
He knew a lot of jokes. And one reason why I read that book, was because a lot of them have personal stories attached. If you want to get more tidbits from Asimov's life that aren't in those huge volumes of memoirs, that's one of the first places to start, because a lot of the jokes talk about his childhood and the circumstances in which the first joke or that joke was first told by Asimov. And so, I read both. He has two huge humor collections that I read while I was doing research for this biography.
Does this have the Jules Verne story in it?
It's a good question. Do you want to tell that story? Or because I know it's in, I want to say it's in his, I don't know if it's in his memoirs.
No, it's in a different book.
I may have gotten it from someone else's, maybe Ben Bova's, reminiscences. His dad, he was talking to his dad about science fiction, and his father asked, "Oh, you mean like Jules Verne? Am I saying it correctly? Like Jules Verne?" And he's like, "Who?" And he's like, "Oh no, he wrote about going under the sea and going to the moon." And Asimov says in his Brooklyn accent, "Oh, you mean Jules Verne?" Yes, that's a good story. That's my Asimov impression. Before we stop, I see there's one question in that's
we should deal with that
about Asimov and transportation. So I should clarify what I said earlier. So I believe he was fine on the train. He definitely took the bus. He loved to drive. In his memoirs, he says that he didn't learn to drive until he was fairly a little bit older. But once he did, he loved it. He drove everywhere. There are a lot of stories about him and his car, like getting his car repaired in his memoirs. Very interesting stuff. But he hated flying. I mean, as far as I can recall, he was on a plane maybe once in his life, during the
Army.
Just
after World War II, in the Army.
Yeah, he flew home.
Used to be on a plane.
And I don't believe he ever flew again. I think he did eventually realize he enjoyed being on cruise ships. And so he did a lot of talks on cruises, but he never flew.
Yeah. Well, we need to wind up because the time allotted to our little chat has wound down. But thanks very much for the attentive people asking questions. Leslie and Juan San Miguel and the rest of you out there. And thanks for the folks behind the scenes keeping our Zoom going smoothly. There's any closing thoughts, Alec?
You're right. I think we need to kind of balance our affection for Asimov with, a larger consideration of his character. And I think a reason why this matters, paradoxically, in some ways, is that he is still someone who matters a lot to readers. I think other writers from that generation who probably would have been seen as more acclaimed, during let's say the late 30s, have kind of fallen out of the conversation. I don't hear people talking a lot about people like Van Vogt or De Camp or Del Rey, who are people who at the time would have been named, one of the top 5 science fiction writers in Astounding. But Asimov, he still means a lot to people. I think that he's actually one of the few novelists, even now, where if you showed them a picture of him, you showed the average person a picture of them and said, "Who is this man?" I would say Asimov might be the most recognizable novelist in America, even decades after his death. So that's a tribute to his longevity and a tribute to his
Hairstyle.
His hairstyle, yes. You know, it's good to have a personal brand. You know, the sideburns helped a lot. But also, it's like, it also means that, you know, it can be difficult to confront less attractive aspects of someone who a lot of us cared about and thought we knew. You know, I grew up with his voice in my head, you know, and I definitely understand how it can be difficult to talk about things that weren't obvious to people who grew up reading those books.
Yeah. It's he was perfectly delightful, and it was a great thrill when I met him and got to have lunch with him, but he did not grope me.
Right.
He did not slap my fanny or any of that kind of stuff, which was, by the way, he was a man of his time, and in his time, that was not acceptable behavior. That was appalling behavior for
right.
It.
Yeah, no, I mean, people would, yes, I mean, I know we're gotta wrap up soon, but I'll close by saying, you know, I mean, I've occasionally seen people who say, well, you know, we shouldn't judge Asimov by the standards of his time, but it was extreme enough that people like Harlan Ellison mentioned it. You know, a lot of people in the memoirs single out Asimov, saying this guy was handsy in a way that exceeded any kind of acceptable behavior. And so even in like the 60s, 70s, 80s, you know, it was noticeable and it was commented upon and it was recognized.
It's time to say goodbye, folks. We will repair to the anyway. I will be available in the Olentangy even room over on Discord if you want to keep typing a little chat. But thank you very much, Alec. This has been great, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Yes, same here. Thank you so much. We'll see you later.
Thanks to both of the presenters, and yes, the conversation can continue.